Hello and welcome to the first episode of In the Archives, a history podcast, where each episode we will discuss and examine a primary source document. Primary source is an artifact, document, diary, manuscript, autobiography, recording, or other source of information that was created at the time being studied. I'm your host, Katie Bell. And happy 4th of July for those listening on the day this podcast comes out. Thank you. In honor of Independence Day, I thought that it would be fun to discuss the document that started it all. That, of course, is the Declaration of Independence, signed by 56 men representing all 13 colonies. I would like to add a little context before I read the Declaration of Independence. The road to independence was a long one. For many years, the American colonies were self sufficient. They governed themselves and defended their borders by themselves. They didn't really depend on England for much help. However, after the French and Indian War, England found itself in a deep financial crisis. To help them get out of this fiscal crisis, England decided to tax its colonies. By 1765, the stamp tax was initiated, a tax on paper products and other goods. That very same year, the British also enacted the Quartering Act, which was an act that forced the colonists to house and feed British soldiers, whose purpose for being there was to defend the British borders, which they gained through the French and Indian War. The British soldiers on the Quartering Act, along with the stamp tax, were unwelcomed by the Americans. 2 years later, the Townshend Act was introduced, which taxed glass and tea along with other goods. Through these acts, tensions began to rise between the American colonists and Great Britain. On March 3rd, 1770, the first of many atrocities of the decade occurred: Boston Massacre. 3 years later, on December 16th, 1773, a group of disgruntled Bostonians, the Sons of Liberty, threw tea in the harbor in protest of the taxes. This is, of course, was known as the Boston Tea Party. A couple months later, Great Britain responded by issuing a series of acts directed towards the Massachusetts Bay Colony called the Coercive Acts, or as the Americans like to call it, the Intolerable Acts. These acts were to punish the Massachusetts Bay Colony for their actions at the Boston Tea Party. On April 19th, 1775, the first shots of the war would be fired at Lexington and Concord. Before the year was over, Congress named Washington as the Major General of the Continental Army. On June 10th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and appointed a committee of 5 men to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. These men are John Adams, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingstone, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson would be the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and on July 4th, 1776, Congress ratified the document. It reads: The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light of transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, invices a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from depository of their public records, for the sole purposes of fatiguing them into compliance with its measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing mainly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large of their exercise. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without the convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to law for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their office and the amount of the payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new officers and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment of any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in neighboring provinces, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule in these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with to legislate for us all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the work of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring us on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to rule a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislators to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of their circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounce our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare these colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Okay, let's break this down. The Declaration of Independence can be broken down into 5 sections: the introduction, preamble, evidence of abuses, appeals to the colonists, and the conclusion. I could spend an entire episode on each section, but for the purposes of today's episode, I will stick to a brief summary of each section. The first 2 sections, the introduction and preamble, set up the tone of the document. It states the goals they wish to achieve. The next 2 sections, evidence of abuses and appeals by the colonists, sections 3 and 4, give context and answers the question of how did we get to this point. The final section, section 5, is the climax of the document, as it clearly states that America is now independent of Great Britain and considers itself a country. The first paragraph is the introduction. Jefferson starts off strong by clearly stating the purpose of this document. He states, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Jefferson is stating that this document would sever the ties between England and America. Jefferson does not just state the purpose, but he also states the reason why this breakup is happening, which is England has violated the laws of nature and God that is entitled to everyone. The main takeaway from the introduction is that it is the right of the people to stand up against a tyrannical government. The second paragraph is the preamble. This paragraph touches on Lockean philosophy, mainly the laws of nature, which Jefferson refers to as unalienable rights. John Locke was an English Enlightenment philosopher who is known as the father of liberalism. Locke's core beliefs were embedded in the free natural life rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is these free rights that Jefferson refers to as unalienable. These rights are truths that we hold to be self-evident, and as the creation of God are entitled to these rights, yet they have been stripped away from us by a tyrannical government. Jefferson states, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object and vices are designed to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and provide guards for their new future security. Jefferson will explain the long train of abuses in the next section. But for now, the main takeaway for this section is Jefferson is declaring that we have rights given to us by God and nature. These rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet these rights were stolen from us, and we want them back. The third section is the evidence of abuses. Jefferson gives 27 examples of abuses. Many of them stem from the Stamp Act, Townshend Act, and Quartering Act. Oh, and the Intolerable Acts. I will not go over every instance, but I will go over a few, starting with number 1. He has refused his assent to laws. Assent to laws is something that is mentioned a lot throughout the grievances. Assent to laws is the official agreement or approval of an idea, plan, or request. As we see in the document and in a list of grievances, the king and parliament has refused to grant approval for any laws that the colonists may pass. The colonists had local assemblies in which they would suggest a law, and they would send that over to England. However, those laws would just sit on a desk and collect dust and not get passed. The next grievance number 4. He has called legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from their depository of their public records. This is a reference to the Intolerable Acts, preferably the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774, which revoked Massachusetts' charter, and the governor was changed to one loyal of Great Britain. Jefferson also alludes to this being done to other colonies or will be done to other colonies if it's not stopped. Grievance number 5, he has resolved representative houses repeatedly. An example of this is in 1767 when the British disbanded the New York Assembly for not following the Quartering Act. Grievance number 7, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for the purposes of obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, references Parliament revoking the Plantation Act of 1744, which was revoked in 1773. Revoking this act was a power play and one to control the colonies after the Boston Tea Party. Grievance number 11, standing armies in times of peace. This grievance refers to the decision that Great Britain made at the conclusion of the French and Indian Wars. England decided to keep its standing armies in America in order to protect its borders. However, Americans did not welcome this extended stay. Grievance 15, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. What instance is the author of the Declaration referring to? For most people, the answer may be obvious, the Boston Massacre. Well, if you know anything about the Boston Massacre trials, it would. However, I don't believe that the authors are citing the Boston Massacre trials here for two reasons. One being John Adams, and the two being the location of the massacre. So, John Adams was chosen as a co author on the Declaration of Independence, and he, along with Benjamin Franklin, edited Jefferson's draft. So, why is Adams being an author and editor a point of contention? Well, John Adams' landmark case as a lawyer was defending the British soldiers accused of killing 5 men during the Boston Massacre. This was a landmark case for Adams, and this case could be the one that either made him into the man he is or broke him, relegating him to just another name in the county record. But one thing to keep in mind that is really important about the Boston Massacre is that a lot of what we know about it and what we're taught in our history class is based on myth and has become a watered down version of the event. If you want to know more about the Boston Massacre, Hilaire Zobel has a great book on the massacre and the subsequent trials entitled The Boston Massacre. So back to the trial. John Adams defended these 5 men, and after a long trial, the soldiers did end up getting acquitted. This was mainly a case of self-defense. The crowd was surrounding the custom house. A group of soldiers were outside, and the argument was they fired in self-defense, and the jury believed their case. All in all, this was still a very important case in the career of John Adams, and I don't think Adams was going to let anyone discredit his win. This is reason number 1 why I don't think Grievance 15 is referring to the Boston Massacre. Reason 2 is location. The other problem was the location of the event and the trial. Boston was a hotbed for revolutionary activity. You had the Sons of Liberty there who conducted meetings and protests in Boston. And the town was hit hardest by the Stamp and Townshend Act because it was a port city. They were not going to let the massacre go without a fight. For all intents and purposes, the Boston Massacre trials were very real. The jury had to be sequestered one point, and there were threats of protest and violence during the trials. So this was a wild trial, and I'd love to touch on the trial in a later episode, so stay tuned. Those 2 reasons are the reasons why I think Jefferson and the other authors would be referring to a different case. I'm not the only one who thinks this. The National Park Services also did a breakdown of all the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. Follow us on Twitter at in the archives for the link. And they cite an incident that occurred in Maryland. This other instance happened in 1768, 2 years before the massacre in Annapolis, Maryland, when two soldiers killed some colonists. They had a trial and got acquitted. This is most likely the instance that Jefferson is referring to. Moving on to grievance number 25, the transporting of large armies of mercenaries. This, of course, is referring to the Hessian army or Germans. There were about 30,000 of them who came over from Europe, and they landed in America on August 15th, 1776. The main takeaway from the grievances is that the British actions toward the colonists through the different acts and lack of proper rule assent to laws, in some instances had led them to their current predicament. The next section number 4 of the Declaration of Independence, is the appeals by the colonists. Here, Jefferson indirectly states the many appeals the colonists had made to England in order to garner peace between the two nations. The first sentence states, "In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms." Jefferson is not referring to the riots and protests that took place because of the tyrannical laws passed by Great Britain. There was a great deal of diplomacy involved in attempts to make peace with Great Britain without the need of fighting. All the Americans wanted was the freedoms they enjoyed before the acts passed in the 1760s. All they wanted was their autonomy. However, England would refuse to listen to the Americans' pleas. On October of 1774, the Continental Congress issued a formal statement demanding that Britain dissolves the coercive acts, the new Quebec Acts, and every other statute they had placed on America since the end of the French and Indian War. 12 out of the 13 colonies, Georgia excluded, signed this letter. Great Britain refused to accept the statement. Benjamin Franklin was also sent to Great Britain in order to smooth things over with Parliament. After all, Nick Bunker, author of America on the Edge and historian, states that Lord Chatham was one of two political opponents whom the cabinet could not ignore. The other was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was a man who the British cabinet and parliament could not ignore. Franklin and Lord North, the head of parliament, sat down for peace talks. The Americans' goal was to preserve the union between Great Britain and America. Boston would pay for what they destroyed for their protests, and Britain would appeal the tea tax and any other tax and act placed on them. However, this deal was rejected by North, and in the months following, there would be no more negotiating, as a single shot would be heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. Bunker writes, "Once the government had chosen to use force, there could be no turning back, and no turning back indeed." Which brings us to the final section of the Declaration, Independence. The main takeaway from Section 4 is to highlight the fact that the efforts are made to make peace. Things got ugly because the British refused to listen. The Americans saw no other way but to divorce from Great Britain once and for all. Because Great Britain decided to use force in Lexington and Concord, the Americans had no other choice but to take up arms and fight for their freedom. It is here in the conclusion where the writers of the Continental Congress make it clear that this is not a civil war, a war between citizens of the same country, but a war between two separate and independent nations. America no longer sees itself as a British colony, but as a fully independent republic. The last paragraph states that these united colonies are and right ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right to do. So this is all one sentence, and in this very long sentence, the Declaration is declaring independence and a separation from Great Britain. It is also saying this is what we have the right to do as a nation. We can levy a war between anyone, we can conclude with peace, and we can create alliances and establish our commerce. We have the right to do everything that you can do. This was the American statement of freedom. This is what the document builds to, this very long sentence. After a year of fighting, America has finally declared its independence from Britain and declared to the world that they are now a new country. So on this day, 248 years ago, the Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 different men representing all 13 colonies, declaring that America is its own country and is now freed from the tyrannical grip of Great Britain. Today, on July 4th, we celebrate that fact. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow this podcast and turn on the bell notification so you can be notified when the next episode comes out. Also, please consider leaving a review. It would help us out greatly and would recommend this podcast to others. You can find us on X or Twitter at _ in the archives, and join us next time for another episode of In the Archives. I don't want to give too much away, but the next episode will be about the Titanic. So, see you next time.